The Star-Spangled Banner is a love song to slavery. Now, you don't know that because fully 3/4 of the national anthem is no longer recited. Now, how on earth can the would-be defenders of this trash claim to love the national anthem and they don't even know 75% of it? Most white people think the Star-Spangled Banner was written in tribute to the American Revolution, but it wasn't. It was written decades after that war. The poem, written by white supremacist Francis Scott Key, was meant as a memorial to the Battle of Fort McHenry, which took place during the War of 1812, which was essentially a failed attempt by the British to reclaim their former North American colonies. Its shameless adoration of war and lauding of slavery was so endearing to the white powers that be, they wanted this to be the nation's theme song. It hit all the same buttons as the Christian battle hymns during the Crusades. First, let's look at the third stanza of the national anthem. Now, there's plenty else wrong with it, but we need to focus on this in particular. In his poem, Key devoted a couple of verses to the vanquished British forces who had tried to overthrow the American rebels. Quote, "And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country should leave us no more, their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave." Did you get that? No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. Now, when Key talks about slaves, he is specifically referring to black ex-slaves who took part in the war on behalf of the British. Unlike the black Americans still imprisoned in the U.S., blacks who fought for Britain made a conscious choice, a free decision, something that Francis Scott Key dedicated his perverted existence to stopping. And he calls the hallowed footsteps of these moral warriors polluted, then goes on to say that there would be no refuge for slaves except retreat or death. This is a song that white people thought proper as the national anthem and still do. No amount of censorship can make this all right. Nobody says Roman Polanski is okay if we just ignore that he raped a child. Nobody's giving Bill Cosby the benefit of the doubt, and he hasn't even been proven guilty of any wrongdoing. Nate Parker was found innocent of crimes, and yet people want to blacklist him. But a slave-owning white supremacist who persecuted abolitionists and wrote love songs to slavery? Why, we ought to give him a place of honor, and don't you dare say a word about him. Welcome to the twisted morality of white supremacy. But you can't understand the racist and vile nature of the Star-Spangled Banner without first examining its racist author. Now, this is going to be entirely new information for most of you since the white media and white school systems have not taught you this in 200 plus years. So, when I tell you the media and school system's job is indoctrination, not education, that's exactly what I mean. Francis Scott Key was a Southerner, born in Maryland. That's already a problem. He became a lawyer and, at the age of 19, began buying black people as slaves. I want you to think about that. This chump wasn't old enough to drink legally, nor even out of his teenage years, but he was already trying to build a plantation for himself. He was installed as the U.S. Attorney General for Washington, D.C. in 1833. And he immediately used his position as a federal prosecutor to persecute abolitionists. He went after anyone who published material criticizing slavery or promoting the abolition of it. His favorite judicial tactic was to prosecute people for the crime of libel, such as Benjamin Lundy, who declared that there was neither mercy nor justice for colored people in D.C. A reasonable and truthful accusation by any standard, except to Francis Scott Key. He instead charged Lundy with attempting to, quote, injure, oppress, aggrieve, and vilify the good name, fame, credit, and reputation of the magistrates and constables of Washington. These are slave catchers and corrupt racists who dedicated their lives to killing and persecuting black people. And U.S. Attorney Key praised these animals for having good names and reputations. Lundy was forced to flee town in order to avoid conviction. But the judicial race soldier Francis Scott Key wasn't done yet. He next went after Reuben Crandall, who Key prosecuted merely for having possession of pro-abolition reading materials. So much for the First Amendment, huh? Say, didn't Key write something about the land of the free? Well, Key's alleged reason for the trumped-up charges was that a few days earlier there had been a race riot caused when a black man had been falsely accused of attempting to kill a white woman. The black man, Arthur Bowen, who was a slave, didn't harm the white woman who owned the plantation, naturally, though he did flee, which seemed to be the real crime. In the so-called Snow Riots, white marauders destroyed the businesses of black D.C. residents, destroyed black schools, all over a lie. But for some reason, U.S. Attorney Francis Key never found reason to prosecute his fellow white thugs run amok, though he did find a way to blame Reuben Crandall for the white rioters, claiming that it was Crandall's pamphlets that caused the slaves to become disobedient to white people. At the trial, in his closing remarks to the jury, Francis Scott Key said this: "I consider this one of the most important cases ever tried here. We are to give up our slaves, not for compensation, not gradually as we may be enabled to substitute other labor, but absolutely, unconditionally, immediately. Nor is that all. They are to remain among us, to be admitted immediately to a full and equal participation in all civil and social privileges. That we have no more rights over our slaves than they have over us. Does not this bring the Constitution and the laws under which we live into contempt? Is it not a plain invitation to resist them? Are you willing, gentlemen, to abandon your country, to permit it to be taken from you and occupied by the abolitionist, according to whose taste it is to associate and amalgamate with the Negro? Or, gentlemen, on the other hand, are there laws in this community to defend you from the immediate abolitionist who would open upon you the floodgates of such extensive wickedness and mischief?" Did you get that? He called freedom of black people wicked. But before that, he said, would these good white folks abandon their country? Allow it to be taken from them? Gee, now we know where the "we want our country back" line of crap came from. And U.S. Attorney Key made it very clear who the white people needed to take their country back from. But even this impassioned defense of slavery wasn't enough. Crandall was miraculously acquitted. But look at the tactics, the depths that U.S. Attorney Francis Scott Key was willing to stoop to persecute those who saw slavery for the evil that it is. And look at how he praised it and praised those who partook of it. This is the degenerate who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. Not only was he belligerent in his advocacy for the rape and pillage of Africa, he was also a founder of the American Colonization Society, a group of white supremacists who wanted to deport all the free blacks to Africa because these good white folks felt that the presence of free blacks would make the enslaved black people want to be free. Next time some white person wants to tell you how racist Francis Scott Key wasn't, you remind them of the American Colonization Society. Because a man is nothing but the ideas and institutions that he leaves to this world. And Francis Scott Key left institutions of slavery, ideas of racism, genocide, and injustice. There is nothing about this creature that should be praised. Except to white people, it would seem. Because in the face of the protests by black athletes against the national anthem, the white media has spent a lot of ink and bandwidth trying to push the racist lie that Francis Scott Key wasn't a racist, and neither was his love poem to slavery. CNN ran a so-called article that was a bald-faced lie, saying that the national anthem's critics were missing the point. No, we get the point clearly. A character named Mark Clegg had the gall to write, "The Star-Spangled Banner in no way glorifies or celebrates slavery." Well, apparently he never read it. But he wasn't alone. The LA Times ran a headline saying how the Star-Spangled Banner, racist or not, became our national anthem. Racist or not? So apparently the LA Times isn't sure whether praising the deaths of black people is racist. Nice to know. But predictably, it was Francis Scott Key's home state newspaper of the Baltimore Sun that decided to give the most shameless defense to him. They had the nerve to write a sloppy love letter, vainly masquerading as an article. I'm not making that up, by the way. A woman named Mary Carol McCauley wrote an article that actually was headlined, "Star-Spangled Banner Writer Had Complex Record on Race." She then went on to call Francis Scott Key handsome, well-educated, born to an aristocratic family on a plantation, and seemed to thoroughly enjoy the good things life had to offer. Yeah, good things like slavery, which he partook of from an early age, though Macaulay conveniently omits all of this. Next, she called him lusty, then, incredibly, immediately followed that description by calling him a family man. But the icing on the cake was that she then went on to call him deeply pious. So much for lusty, huh? This doesn't read like an article, it reads like the synopsis for a cheap romance novel, 50 Shades of Racism. But do you notice how she goes to great lengths to avoid the obvious connection between Francis Scott Key and slavery? His family didn't merely have a plantation, they had a slave plantation. But the writer never mentions that. These white media outlets are so busy trying to prop up the fallen reputation of this racist animal that they tie their forked tongues in knots. Notice the cheap propaganda. The writer asks, is Key to be celebrated for the few instances in which he clearly saw and stood up for what was right, at one point even putting himself in danger? Or should he be held accountable for his and his society's blind spots? This is a good opportunity to educate you about the use of words in propaganda. The number of words devoted to a particular subject tells you exactly how important it is to the speaker. In this one paragraph alone, the writer devotes most of the words to trying to absolve Key of his racism. Word after word, but very quickly, kind of as an afterthought, says, should he be held accountable for his society's blind spots? First of all, slavery wasn't a societal blind spot. It was and is the main focus of this society. As we've already shown, slavery wasn't some minor issue for Francis Scott Key. It was his mission in life. He was a slave owner and dedicated his existence to perpetuating it. Secondly, this cheap attempt at whitewashing Key's sins falls flat. This writer wants us to praise Key for his alleged good deeds, but when talking about his undeniable support of slavery, she then wants to blame the entire society for his actions? So for the one or two things he may have done right according to her, she gives him sole and total credit. But when it comes to the mountain of immoral acts that he committed himself, she then decides that we should hold the entire society accountable? It wasn't the whole society that brought false charges against abolitionists. It was Francis Scott Key. It wasn't the whole society that called freedom for black people wicked. That was Francis Scott Key who said it. And he lost a few of those cases, so clearly he was the one fighting against the society's wishes. It wasn't the whole society who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, it was Francis Scott Key. This is the same Baltimore where Key may have passed through during his legal career, and they show that they have not evolved one iota since his time. The article was one long debunked white-splaining talking point after the other. They even trotted out the old, "you can't judge the 19th century by the 21st century standards" line. Notice how we never hear that about the Japanese invasion of Korea in the 19th century? We never hear white people say that the Germans in the 1930s can't be judged by 21st century standards. No group's past barbarity is ever immune from criticism, except white people's towards black people. It's one thing to drag out the old saw about Francis Scott Key being a man of his time, but these good white people don't even criticize him or condemn him today. If you're expecting a balanced look at Key that explains why a song written by a slave-owning white supremacist who, by their own admission, hated black people should be unacceptable, then you won't find it in the Baltimore Sun. The only relevant question is this: should a perverted song written by a degenerate 200 years ago that even they admit doesn't reflect any of the character or values of the nation today be the national anthem? How can a nation in 2016 sing a song whose lyrics have nothing to do with it today? We always hear that the U.S. Constitution is a living, breathing document. As the society changes, so does it. The national flag has certainly changed, from a segmented serpent in the beginning to 13 stars to 15 stars to 50 today. The names of various government posts have changed, such as the War Department, today called the Department of Defense. The oath of office for the presidency has changed. And yet, when it comes to this slave owner's carol, it ought to be sacrosanct? Does that sound like liberals doing abstract thinking, or white supremacists attempting to bury their bigotry under an avalanche of words? The truth is that we do have a moral and intellectual obligation to look at the past through the prism of the present. We have a right and duty to judge history by the standards of today, because the truth is that every society since ancient times has known that slavery is wrong. Even the founders of the United States, in private, remarked about how they knew what they were doing was wrong, and how history would judge them harshly, no matter what they may have said publicly. This is what white people refuse to accept. You cannot praise Thomas Jefferson for allegedly freeing his slaves after his death, mind you, without acknowledging that he knew it was wrong to have them enslaved in the first place. The Baltimore Sun's pathetic defense of Key by calling him complex also fails when you consider that they damn sure never say that Louis Farrakhan's past is complex when it comes to the Jews. They don't say Bill Cosby's past is complex when it comes to white women. The old "it's a complex issue" defense only gets dragged out when it's time to defend white people. These clowns admit that he was a bigot. They admit that he believed blacks were intellectually and morally inferior to whites. They cop to all the accusations that are made about Francis Scott Key, mainly because they can't deny them. But then they turn right around and say, well, he wasn't as bad as all that. Let me tell you, there is nothing complex about the sick, twisted, evil bastard Francis Scott Key was. Nothing complex about his adoration for slavery, his blatant celebration of the genocide of people far better than himself. His venality and corruption and racism is simple, straightforward, and indefensible. This is the typical standard tactic of the white media. When they can't refute the truth, they instead retreat to lying outright. Their goal is to confuse the issue by muddying the waters with public propaganda pieces whose headlines say that the national anthem and its creator weren't racist, and then when you read it, you see that they admit that he was. The white media's job is to psychologically masturbate white people, and they love having their egos diddled by the media. And to show you how absurd this topic has become, you even had one of Key's degenerate descendants claim that Colin Kaepernick is disgracing himself by not standing for the anthem. She actually had the trash nerve to say that. Quote, "If he's not going to honor his country and his countrymen, he's dishonoring himself." Now, didn't we already cover earlier that it was Francis Scott Key himself who declared on the record, in a court of law no less, that the United States belongs to white people and not black people? He founded an organization that would have deported Colin Kaepernick for not being a slave. That's what the American Colonization Society was created for, to get rid of free blacks, like Colin Kaepernick. Funny how she never mentions that, and the white media doesn't mention it either, and this geriatric gas bag also said that she was hurt by the protests. Well, I'm not one to take glee in anyone's suffering, but in this case, I'm laughing my black ass off. This is what white supremacy hates most, that we are denying them the righteous judgment of history. Francis Scott Key is being put on trial, and we're using his own words to hang him. Well, just goes to prove the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. As I've always told you, the times may change, but these people don't. And do you notice that no one in the white media has taken this wrinkled old racist to task? No one has portrayed her blatant defense of slavery as controversial. No one fact-checks what she said. No one says anything. They treat her lies as if there was some sort of basic validity to them. So make no mistake, the Star-Spangled Banner must die because we demand it. The power of new black media's reach is far greater than you think. We are part of a new media ecosystem that is emboldening and encouraging those fighting against white supremacy. Tariq Nasheed recently revealed that he had been called by Colin Kaepernick, who is apparently a big fan of the Hidden Colors series. I said before that Colin Kaepernick was courageous for standing alone. Well, it would seem that the reason he could was because he knew that he wasn't alone. Right now, we are part of a media subculture, an emerging media ecosystem that is directly taking on the lies and misdirection of the white media. We are making it where they can no longer have all the say. Our message of talking with your wallet is being heard by someone. Black football fans, and even casual ones, have bought Kaepernick's jersey in support. Black veterans and even white ones are supporting him. New black media. We are the first place you heard someone say that Colin Kaepernick was right. We are the only ones you've heard point out that the lie that policing is dangerous work is not true at all. I am proud of the work that I've done to attack the white supremacist police's talking points, to expose their lies, to point out racist DAs like Anita Alvarez, Angela Corey, and Tim McGinty, all of whom have been sent packing by the voters. We make no apologies for being black first because we live in a society run by white supremacists like Francis Scott Key, determined to keep black people dead last. I'm proud of the work that I've done exposing the silent genocide of white-on-white crime and to debunk the lie of black-on-black crime. I am proud of the fact that we've given voice and support to black men who were previously being steamrolled by the white media, like Rico Gray. I'm proud to have put black economic empowerment on the map and at the forefront of issues concerning black people. Most of all, I'm proud of the work that I've done to undermine and destroy the white media's stranglehold on the public consciousness. And even though the white media retains much of its monopoly, there is finally the beginnings of a black media fighting to counter them. A new black media that is blasting cowards like Ray Lewis, repudiating liars like Jason Whitlock, and debunking professional white-ass kissers like Jerry Rice, Shaquille O'Neal, and Lil Wayne. We recognize these clowns for the mumble-mouthed, buck-dancing meat puppets for white supremacy that they are. We understand they sold their souls a long time ago, and they're showing us who's holding the receipts. But we've managed to isolate them. Never underestimate the importance of black people having a real voice, one that is loud enough to be heard. Colin Kaepernick drew strength from our words, strength from our presence, courage from knowing that we were out here. The Colin Kaepernick protest is the direct result of what we do in places like these. It does matter. This is not some tug of war between white studio executives and some black busybodies throwing stones at their ivory towers. They use the media as a weapon to justify murdering black people, to protect the killers from scrutiny and to slander the murdered, then distract the public with celebrity gossip or some other mind rot. And the white media is not doing this because they're clueless or careless. They're doing it because they are the propaganda wing of white supremacy. How many white TV, radio, newspaper, or movie studio employees have you seen caught making racist statements, pushing racist rhetoric, or acting as if not killing black people is some sort of outrageous suggestion? I would hope that it hasn't slipped your notice that even Stephen A. Smith and Don Lemon have had to change their tune in the face of the drubbing they've gotten from us. We've damaged them as tools of anti-black propaganda. Their white handlers understand that they aren't useful as apologists for white supremacy anymore. So the white media has upped the ante by bringing in a new squad of coons, ones who are higher profile than Smith and Lemon. You've never heard Shaquille O'Neal spew quite the kind of crap he did this last week. He went full Michael Jordan on us, didn't he? A guy who never seemed to have a strong opinion on black people, politics, or the police, all of a sudden wants to be Captain America? Now you know damned well some white handlers put those words in his mush mouth. They sure as hell didn't come from what passes for his brain. And Jason Whitlock. What is there to be said about this bloated moron? He got himself fired from ESPN a year or so ago for shooting off his mouth, and I suppose the job offers he imagined would come rolling in never did. These clowns never learn, whether it's Bryant Gumbel, Roland Martin, or Melissa Harris, whatever. They think they can climb the ladder when the truth is, where black media employees are concerned, there is no ladder, only a basement. They routinely suspend or fire black on-air talent as a way to justify limiting their careers. About the only black network personality who hasn't gotten the treatment is Lester Holt of NBC, and that's only because Brian Williams' disgraceful demotion came so suddenly that they had no one else to replace him with. And NBC News standings and the ratings were so low they couldn't afford to whiteball Lester Holt. But Lester may not want to get too comfortable. From what I've seen, Brian Williams is back on MSNBC, so the rehabilitation of his career has already begun, as if he didn't lie about an event overseas, same way Ryan the Liar Lochte did, as if he didn't provoke an international incident. Well, when you're white, there's no such thing as a career-ending mistake. And when you're black, there's no such thing as a career-making accomplishment. The white media doesn't exist to inform. It never has. It exists to indoctrinate. And nowhere has that been more clear than in the white media's pathetic attempts to trot out some black tools to defend the national anthem. They figured if they could just drag out a few token Negroes who they paid to say the right lies, it would effectively nullify the growing black athletic swell of protest. And these tools are all being marched out to do their white masters' bidding at gunpoint. This is clear and obvious, and as I've told you in my last video, sports stars are at best castrated icons, useful to an oppressive society because they are members of the oppressed, unable to speak out against oppression. And this thinly veiled racial coercion by the dominant society has been made quite clear. They tell black men daily that we better think twice before doing or saying anything that displeases the dominant society. They try to pretty it up with talk about how things are different now, etc., but we all know this is a lie. They and we realize nothing has changed. And that's the whole point. They know as well as we do that the national anthem celebrates slavery, and that's the entire point. To make black men accept a status quo that runs us into the ground daily. To see those who initiated a genocide against us and those who perpetuate it given places of honor in the society in which we reside, and to be told that we had better stand and salute them too. This is how a society breaks the spirit of those it wishes to keep enslaved. And that process of a necessity must be a perpetual one. Each new generation of slaves must be put through a psychological breaking process, a perverted mind bending. Every day you must reinforce that the slaves are to honor the slave masters and punish them when they don't. What do you think is being done when black children are made to go to schools without books or adequate facilities, but every day are told that they better stand and take the Pledge of Allegiance? Even Christians don't reavow their devotion to God 5 times a week. Jefferson, Washington, and Key may be dead, but their descendants are not, and neither is the white supremacist superstate that they brought into being through our slave labor. So long as they enjoy the spoils of our labor, so long as their race soldiers kill us without consequence, so long as the government that imprisoned us and slaughters us is not held to account, we recognize they are at war with us, and we will never stand for that. This is what the attempted and failed scandalizing of Colin Kaepernick is truly meant to achieve, to teach black people to know their place. Only white people are allowed to criticize the white government, don't you know? But the protests by black men have now spilled off of the playing fields and into the media arenas themselves. We've seen Charles Woodson, former NFL player who directly attacks Francis Scott Key and boldly points out the racial hypocrisy of mourning 9/11 while ignoring the wholesale slaughter of black citizens at the hands of the police. He excoriated the national anthem and explained why no one should stand for it. And he hasn't been the only one. Shannon Sharpe has also given multiple takedowns of the national anthem. Jack Brewer, another former NFL player, took off his tap dancing shoes for a few minutes on the Fox Business Channel of all places, and while not properly excoriating the anthem, he did nonetheless support Colin Kaepernick outright, to the chagrin of Maria Bartiromo and her white co-anchors, and he didn't back down when they attacked him. So even the sewer of Fox News has not been able to avoid hearing the truth from a black man. And have you noticed that not one white media outlet is trying to take these black men to task for their words? Not one white media outlet is fact-checking their claims. The white media is terrified to say a word about them. To do so would require them to talk about the fact that the guy who wrote the national anthem was a slave-owning white supremacist. And the more that is discussed, the worse the situation gets. They want this story to quiet down, to go away. But it keeps spreading and getting louder. Already they are plotting how to institute some new rules in the NFL to prevent these protests in the future, but that won't solve this problem. Even if the NFL were to decide today that none of the players can sit for the national anthem, the fact that former players are saying the anthem is wrong and the discussion this has provoked proves this will go on with or without them. Suppose the players make it an issue that they won't renew their contracts unless the Star-Spangled Banner is no longer played at their games. Think it far-fetched? Well, a month ago, it was far-fetched for a player to sit down, or for players to raise the black fist, or for them to take a knee during the national anthem. It only takes one black man who has the courage to stand or sit to get the ball rolling. A protest that has proven resistant to the standard defense from the dominant society. They've tried one pathetic straw man after the other, and each deflection only forces them closer to the issue. They can't stop it from being a story because every Sunday, Monday, and Thursday, on the world's biggest media stage, black men are protesting, and college athletes and high school kids as well. They can't cover this up, can't minimize it, can't move on to something else they would prefer to talk about, like, say, Bill Cosby. Some of these white supremacists in the media have tried the feeble dodge of saying that the black high school students protesting the national anthem don't realize what they're protesting. Never mind the fact that they never say anything about white children at Tea Party rallies, 6-year-olds holding up signs protesting Obamacare. Now, does anyone truly believe that a 6-year-old knows the first thing about the Affordable Care Act or about how the federal government's budget is outlaid for health care? But the white media keeps saying these lies anyway. They don't have anywhere else to go. We've taken the control of the subject out of their hands, and that is what they fear. Today we're taking on a dead slave-holding songwriter. Tomorrow we'll be coming for the white media itself. Because the white media's efforts to dictate to the public what it should be thinking and doing regarding this issue have gone from the usual oblique hints to strong suggestions to, at this point, outright demands. And they know it's a total lie. There is no other national anthem in all the history of the world which needed to have fully 3/4 of its content censored and scrubbed from public view merely to make it marginally palatable to decent people. And the majority of white people aren't willing to admit that there may be something wrong with that. At some point, white people will have to admit that there's something wrong with the Star-Spangled Banner, either by choice or by coercion. And while we're on the subject of black people's behavior, I want to comment on a disgusting trend that I've noticed among some black people since this Copernic affair started. A lot of black closet nationalists have begun to stick their heads up. People who we'd never seen or heard a syllable of African interest from. Funny how that seems to happen at times like this. Let me go on record as saying that I will not tolerate any of the black people who had, until recently, not said a word about the national anthem or this country's institutions to suddenly decide they have a right to speak now. You cowards have been silent all this time, and you will remain silent. You go along to get along Negroes out of nowhere discover your black nationalism for a hot second, but only after other people have stood up and done the hard work of taking that initial stand. There's a reason that we in intelligent black society have had the courage to spit on the holidays and so-called heroes of the dominant society. We can only honor something that benefits us, and these animals have not. We can only honor something that we have chosen to honor, and black people have had no choice in the national anthem. A lot of black people thought we were being petty and off-topic when we made an issue of not honoring the nation's songs, its flag, a dirty rag, or its presidents. To them, it was a side issue of little importance. or a trivial matter altogether. But these same people, now that they feel it's safe, are suddenly coming out of the woodwork and claiming that they didn't like the Star-Spangled Banner all along either. Black empowerment doesn't need fair-weather friends or Johnny-come-latelys. People too slow to understand how the pillars of warfare work are also too slow to be of any use to us. If you didn't have a problem with the national anthem yesterday, you damn sure won't decide that you have a problem with it now. The white media won't be let off the hook, nor will their black surrogates, and neither will the black cowards who wanted to play it safe. These bastards are waging war on us, and the only safe place in war is victory. Francis Scott Key was trash, plain and simple. End of story. He and his slave carols should be resigned to the trash bin of history. He should be regarded in the same company as Jefferson Davis, George Wallace, and David Duke. As should the Baltimore Sun. We in intelligent black society need to remember these white supremacist dead-enders holding their racist heirlooms in their cold dead hands. The Star-Spangled Banner is an abomination, and we must call it such every chance we get. Do not ever stand for it. Do not ever allow it to be mentioned without reminding people what it truly is. Don't allow your children to stand for it. If any teacher, any school principal, or any function attempts to force you to stand or to otherwise honor the Star-Spangled Banner, then you sue them. The courts are a weapon that we have refused to use for too long. We've outsourced our legal defense to white liberals, and they have done nothing for us. Time for that to change. Anytime the white media or anyone in the society or any politician mentions the national anthem or Francis Scott Key, you tell them that he was a slave owner. People don't know this, and it's our responsibility to ensure that they do, because a large part of the blame for the national anthem falls on us. We've allowed white people to become comfortable with their bigotry. We've stopped teaching people that America's traditions are built on insulting and dehumanizing us, and only us. We don't teach that so much of vintage Americana is in fact based on denigrating black people. It wasn't until the 1960s that the Southern songs like I Wish I Was in Dixie were finally confronted in the society, and white Southerners had conniption fits about that too. Because we've been silent on this. Had we exposed Francis Scott Key decades ago and demanded an end to the playing of his slave anthem, we wouldn't be fighting this battle today. And while I won't say this is a crucial fight, I do say it has merit and meaning, because white supremacy is largely promoted through its cultural institutions. When we take away their icons and traditions, we are undermining them. And to undermine white supremacy whenever and wherever we can should be a daily pursuit for us. No, banning the Star-Spangled Banner is not the end of the war, but it's part of the process. And for that reason alone, it's worthy of our effort. The time is over for white people to dictate to us whether we should be offended by their insults. And the time is over for us to allow these racist traditions to go on, because they always have. It's time to finally close the songbook on the land of the creeps and the home of the depraved.